Tonight I want to look at the title of a lesson entitled Rich Fool. If you have your Bible or one in the pew, you might want to get it because I didn't put the verses up on the PowerPoint tonight because just wanted to do something a little different. But it's found in Luke chapter 12, verse 13 through 21. You know, one of the things in the Bible, one of the things that's interesting about the Bible is the Bible talks about people. It's not just about principles. It's not just about, this point and this point and this point. Thou shalt, thou shalt, thou shalt not, thou shalt not. It's not like that. There's also people. And those people have stories. And some of those stories are really, if you look through Scripture, they're just one or two verses about them. You don't learn a lot about them. Some have several verses. Some even have chapters, and some even longer than that. But those stories are always interesting, and they're there not to fill up space, but they're there to teach us something, to tell us what we need to know. And a lot of the stories of the Bible are illustrative. In other words, they tell the story for us. And that's what we want to look at tonight. This story of the rich fool is really someone that is a story that Jesus told to make a point. And it could have happened. It's kind of interesting because Jesus, as we'll see in just a few minutes, talks about a certain man. And we'll talk about that idea. But these people in the Bible, most of the stories are real. You might say most of the stories, parables. Parables could definitely have happened, but Jesus might not necessarily have been talking about someone specifically, but the story is important because the story is telling the principle that Jesus wants to teach. Now, am I saying that Noah and Abraham and Epaphras and all of those individuals that we think of as individuals are individuals? Yes, they are individuals. Their stories happened as the Bible tells. And so when we talk about, there's things that may have happened but may not have, this is one of them. Could have happened, yes. Did it happen? Possibly, probably, in my thinking, but may not have. But the story that Jesus tells makes the point that Jesus is trying to make to a real person. Having said that, then we have to look at the setting. In Luke chapter 12, Jesus has a multitude of people around him. And Jesus is teaching, and he is showing the individuals that he is teaching them about hypocrisy. And he is teaching them the idea of being authentic individuals, being true followers that are following the Lord for a purpose and a reason, and in order to fulfill what God has said. And as Jesus teaches those folks, as he teaches them those important subjects, there's a certain man that comes up to him and probably comes up to him very cautiously, but very lovingly, and really not meaning to interrupt us. As he does, he asks Jesus, "Teacher, tell my brother to give me my inheritance." Well, isn't that interesting? Teacher, tell my brother to give me my inheritance. Jesus answers this individual, and who he is, like I say, we do not know. But he answers this individual by saying, well, who made me a judge and arbitrator? A judge is the individual, of course, that sits in judgment. An arbitrator is one that's over, say, civil matters or the division, especially in this case, of an inheritance. And Jesus asked him a simple question. Who made me this? This was not Jesus' concern. This was not what Jesus was interested in. Jesus then gives the principle that really then precipitates the story that we're looking at. Jesus tells the man, he says, "Take heed and beware of covetousness, for a man's life consists not of the things which he possesses." Okay. Now imagine you're that individual that stood up and asked Jesus that question. How little do you feel right now? You feel pretty bad. But Jesus uses the interruption, as he always does, to teach a valuable lesson. So he teaches a parable. Now, like we said, this parable may or may not have happened. The story with regards to the man coming to Jesus and interrupting, yes. But this story that Jesus talks about is a story. Now, it's interesting because Jesus begins, first of all, with the person in the story. Who's the person? It's a certain man, certain rich man, whose crops brought forth plenty. It's interesting to me that Jesus uses, and he does use this word quite a lot in his parables, but he uses the word certain. It's the idea of particular. It really, at least for me, now not for everybody that interprets Scripture, but at least for me, it would imply that Jesus had in mind who he's talking about. And the story is something that Jesus either saw or somebody told him, and he knows about it. Now, you might say, you're wrong, preacher. That's fine, because that's my thought, and your thought's different, and that's fine. What matters is the story. The story is a rich man that evidently had done well. This is the person of the story. He had done well. Not only had he done well because he was a rich man, but he had done well and his crops had done well. So he was probably a good farmer or had good land. And so you see, first of all, the person of the story. But then you see, if you will, the problem. The problem arises in that he says, I don't have enough store space. He says, I need to tear down my barns and I need to build greater barns. Well, that's a problem. But his proposal is, I'm going to tear down my barns. I'm going to build greater barns so that I can fill them with storage. I can fill what I have made. I can fill my abundant crop. I can put it up. Now, we know, as we've studied Bible before and studied history, the idea of more storage and tearing down your barns to us in Middle Tennessee does not make sense. It would make sense to add on to your barns, build bigger barns, leave the barn up that you got and build bigger barns. But that's because their barns were different than our barns. Their barns are not the old red, sided barns with the high, if you will, ceilings, high roofs in order to pack hay in. Their barns were dug out of the earth. And so they dug them out of the earth and then they lined them. Then they had what in essence was a cap, and it was level with the ground. And there was your barn. And so to tear down your barns meant that they would go in, tear the lining out of the barn, dig it wider, dig it deeper so that they could put more in it. So they would dig it wider and deeper, line it back again, and then put the crop in it. So there's his proposal. I'm going to tear down my barns and I'm going to build greater barns. And then he said, here's my plan. What's your plan? Then he said, I'm going to take my ease and I'm going to sit back. And I'm going to say to myself, so you have much goods laid up. Eat, drink, and be merry. But then, if you think about it, there is a pronouncement that Jesus makes towards this man. Fool, he says. The word fool there means empty-headed. You're an empty-headed man. Now, I want you to think about this along a couple of lines. Here, a couple of weeks ago or so, someone was talking to Suzanne and I, and we were talking about words that Mama didn't let us use. Like, Mama didn't let me use the word idiot. I couldn't call my sister an idiot. Thought about it a lot of times, but couldn't call her one. She couldn't call me one either. Now, there are probably words like that your mother said, you can't use. Fool was another one that my mother said, can't use that. Yes, ma'am. And so I didn't. But it just means empty-headed. You've seen other words that really our society has told us don't use, and so we are not even going to use them for examples. But Jesus calls this man a fool. And we're going to look tonight at why Jesus called this man a fool. But when he calls him fool, notice what he says. This night, your soul be required of you. For what? For whose will those things be? In other words, it's coming a judgment day. Now I ask you, whose are these going to be? And really, what does it matter? And then of course, he tops it all off. So it is towards you. Lay up treasures for yourself and are not rich towards God. Now, let me say before we look at the story and find out why Jesus called this man a fool, that first of all, it's not wrong to have money. It's not wrong to even be rich by standards of today. It's the love of money that gets us into trouble, and it's how we use our money. That's important. It's important that we use our money for good. And Jesus is trying to show this man that he's so worried about, and think about what Jesus is trying to teach. Jesus is trying to teach against covetousness and greed. Jesus is trying to say, look, I'm not worried about the physical. You remember when he said, who made me judge and arbitrator? I'm not worried about the physical. It's the spiritual that we need to be concerned about. And so he talks about this man, and he calls him a fool. But why does he call him a fool? Well, let me give you 4 reasons why I believe that he called him a fool. The first reason is that he thought, this man in the story, thought of the gift and not of the giver. James reminds us that every good gift and every perfect gift comes from above, from the Father of lights, in whom is no variableness, or some of newer versions say variation, shadow of turning, the old King James Version said. It's the idea that God, of course, is, as we talked about last week, we used that verse last week with regards to shadows. But notice and think about the first part of it. What we have has come from God. This man in this story does not seemingly concern himself with God or what's going on with regards to being concerned about God's will. He's concerned about his crops and saving his crops. Now, you might say, well, preacher, this story doesn't say that he didn't give part of his money to the Lord. You're absolutely right. It doesn't. But the intent is to show that this man is covetous. That's the whole principle that Jesus is teaching with the story. Remember what he said? Beware of covetousness. This man then thought of the gifts, thought of what he had, thought of what he had received. And no man can do anything, can receive anything except it be given to him from above. Isn't that what Jesus said in John 3, verse 27? Now, the context of John 3:27 is not talking about really physical things. The context there in John 3, there were certain of the disciples of John who had come to him and had said, Master, there is someone called John, Master, there's someone that is teaching. And to make it simple, basically his teaching is over yours. They were referring to Jesus. And John says, it's all right. No man can have that anything except it be given to him from above. In other words, his message has come from above. You need to listen to it. What we have has come from above. And this man needed to be reminded of that. He needed to be reminded that it's not just the gifts, but it's the giver. Have you noticed that our social graces have not completely gone, but are leaving? You noticed that? Suzanne and I told you in Bible class went to Whataburger Friday night. And we went to Whataburger, and somehow they made our hamburgers, and I'm sure they made them well, but somebody else got them. And as Suzanne said, bless their hearts, they're going to open up that sandwich and going to take a bite, and they're going to say, where's my lettuce? Because we ordered it without lettuce. They probably are upset. But nevertheless, so we had to wait a little extra long for our sandwiches when they realized, oh, we don't have yours. We made them and gave them to somebody else, so we'll make yours again. We got free apple pie out of it, so it was all right. But I told Suzanne, I said, it would have gone a long ways with me if the assistant manager who brought our food out to us since they had messed up said, oh, we're sorry. We're sorry we gave your food away. And we're sorry you had to wait so long. I said, I would have taken a we're sorry or I apologize. But I said, all I got was this. Yeah. And that's all I got. Isn't it a shame that our social graces have gone? You know, you let somebody in traffic, you let somebody in, you might get a wave. You might get a different wave. Our social graces have gone. Why? We're not thankful. We're not thankful anymore. And Jesus is reminding them, hey, don't forget about the giver in everything. 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, Paul reminds us in verse 18, in everything give thanks. And he's told the church at Ephesus in Ephesians chapter 3, verse 20, giving thanks always for all things to God the Father in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ. This man, I believe Jesus called a fool because he thought more of what can I do with my gifts than where did I get this from? But the second reason that this man may have been called a fool was that he thought about himself and he forgot his neighbor. Well, preacher, once again, it doesn't say anything about he didn't do anything. I agree with you. But I'm just giving you some thoughts about probably why Jesus called this man fool. He thought about himself, but he forgot his neighbor. He thought about what can I do? What can I get out of it? What's gained for me? You remember James talks a little bit about this, don't you? In James chapter 2, James is literally talking about faith and works and what they are and how they go hand in hand and God's will concerning those. But in defining that idea and that principle, he talks about, he says, you know your neighbor has need. And yet, when you get together, when he comes to you, verse 17, he says, you tell him, depart from me in peace, be you warmed and filled. And notwithstanding, you give him nothing. James says, what have you profited him? Well, nothing. You haven't helped him out a bit. You've told him to go his way, but you haven't given him anything. We're reminded that what we have is from God, as we talked a little bit about this morning, and then in the first point of the lessons learned. But we have to remember that whoever has this world's goods and sees his brother has need, needs to, according to 1 John 3, verse 17, needs to help him. This man, at least in this story, at least in the story as Jesus told it, this man did not help his neighbor. This man was concerned about himself. Well, preacher, I believe that he probably pulled out of Matthew 25, there where Jesus said, I was hungry and you gave me food. I was thirsty and you gave me drink. I was naked and you clothed me. And I was sick and you came to see me. I was in prison. You visited me. He said, hey, this man pulled that out. And he may have, but not in this story. You see, he wasn't concerned about his neighbor. Oh, my neighbor's crops didn't go well. They didn't do well. Or my neighbor needs something. Or my neighbor, was unable to work his field. He forgot about his neighbor. We're reminded of how important it is to help our neighbor, to be individuals that are loving and kind and tender and compassionate towards the needs of others. As I was studying this week and looking in my files, I came across a story that I saw back many, many years ago, and I had forgotten it until I began to read it. It happened to me one morning. I had eaten breakfast and I was drinking my coffee and I was looking out the window. And this was probably 35 years ago. So forgive me if I get it wrong, but you won't know the difference. I was looking out my window, and there were two blackbirds underneath our tree, and they were scrounging around. The take 2 steps, scratch, peck, 2 steps, scratch, peck. They were doing that number. There was 2 blackbirds underneath the tree doing this, and there was a mockingbird. Oh, they're such kind birds, but there was a mockingbird up in the tree watching. One of those blackbirds found a prize, a grasshopper. He grabbed it, He began to chomp on it when the mockingbird swooped down and made this horrendous noise, as they tend to do, and scared the poor blackbird, and he jumped back. And when he did, he dropped his grasshopper. The mockingbird picked up the grasshopper, flew back up into the tree to watch again. And the old blackbird just kind of scrounged around again. And here they were, 2 steps, scratch, peck, 2 steps, scratch, peck. Still, when one stops and the mockingbird is still there in his perch watching, and he thinks, evidently, oh, I'll get this one. And so he swoops down on this one and makes a screeching noise. And the old blackbird jumped back. The only problem was he had nothing. And the mockingbird was upset. So the mockingbird flew back up into his perch, only to have a woodpecker come on the ground. And when the mockingbird thought the woodpecker had something, he swooped down, he screeched, and the woodpecker just looked at him. He was probably deaf. But anyway, well, he didn't move. And so you see the idea, though, of the mockingbird. The mockingbird was just after what he could get for himself and wasn't even doing the work. This man, doing the work, I thoroughly believe. But in his preparation of his barns, he forgot about what he could do to help somebody else. Why else might the man be called a fool? Well, he thought about his body, but he forgot about his soul. Well, now that's important, isn't it? Think about what he says. You see, what was his proposal? His plan was tear down the barns, build greater barns. His proposal was that he was going to take up the Epicurean philosophy of eat, drink, and be merry. Now, I want you to hold on to that thought for just a second, and then I want you to hold on to it for the last point with regards to lessons learned. Think about that idea actually came from Ecclesiastes 5. It's the idea of eat, drink, and be merry. You see, that's what he said. I'm going to sit back, and I am going to be able to enjoy my fruits of my labor and do nothing. Well, comes a harvest time for all of us, doesn't it? There comes a time in which you can sit back and you can enjoy the fruits of your labor. Most definitely. Think about this man. I'm going to sit back and I'm going to have a good old time. I'm going to have a high time. He thinks only about his body. It's only about the physical. He thinks nothing about the spiritual, nothing about those things that are eternal. Those things that are important and of important value. Jesus asked the question, what shall a man give in exchange for his soul? What shall it profit a man? He says, if he gains the whole world and he loses his own soul. In that text of Matthew 16, that's the text that in verse 24, Jesus says, if anyone will come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. And then he asks those questions. What will a man give in exchange for his soul? What shall it profit a man if he gains the whole world and loses his own soul? Here's the questions. The questions are in the context of giving up oneself to the Lord. Are you willing to give yourself to the Lord? Are you going to give something this world has in exchange for that? Have you forgot the eternal value of the soul? Now, I would ask if maybe that's what this man had done. We're reminded, though, by the Hebrew writer in Hebrews chapter 2, talking about the language, if you will, the angels, steadfast, and every transgression and disobedience, and a just reward. He asks, verse 3, how shall we escape? If we neglect so great a salvation, that's a question that needs to be asked by all of us, all over the world, not just those of us here. But the idea of we have so great a salvation. What are we willing to give in exchange for it? Well, hopefully nothing. Hopefully we're not willing to give anything in exchange for the soul that we have, and not only for the soul, but for the eternal resting place of heaven itself. Paul was right when he told Timothy that his life consisted not in the things that he possesses. Now, that's interesting because in that context there, in 1 Timothy 6, that's talking about love of money. The love of money is the root. Should be a root. It's not the only root. But love of money is a root of all evil. And he talks about then a man's life does not consist of what he has. It consists far more, doesn't it? This man, though, he thought, and as he thought more about his body. And he really wasn't concerned about his soul or where it would go. And then fourthly, Jesus, if you stop and think about it in this story, telling about this man, as the story as he tells it, ultimately calling this man a fool. This man thought about his life, but he forgot about death. Preacher, how can you say that? Go back to what he says. Go back to what he says. He said, I'll tear down my barns and I'll build greater barns, and I will say to myself, soul, you have many things laid up for you. Eat, drink, and be merry. That's not the Epicurean philosophy in its fullness. The Epicurean philosophy in its fullness is eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. In other words, live it up today because we're going to die tomorrow. Now, like I say, that goes back to Ecclesiastes. That goes back to Solomon. But at the same time, too, there's a philosophy that's carried way too far. This man, though, only thought about eating, and drinking. He didn't think about the dying part. He didn't think about, oh, wait a minute, I'm going to die. The Hebrew writer reminds us that it's appointed to men once to die. Hebrews chapter 9, verse 27. And while death came by men, and the resurrection, or by man, and resurrection came by man, death has passed upon all men. That's what the Hebrew writer, or what Paul wrote, in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 21 and 22. Death is a reality which we may not like to think about, but it's reality. Edward Young said, all men think all men mortal but themselves. There's a lot of truth to that, isn't it? We all think that, we're going to live forever and all the rest of you are going to die. It doesn't work that way. We all will pass from this life, or the Lord will come back again, one of the two, whichever's first. This man, in this story, as Jesus told it, thought about living life. Let me live it to the fullest, but didn't think of the fact that one day he would die. One day he would take his last breath. One day he would no longer be with us. And so we're reminded of the story that Jesus told, or the principle really that Jesus told in Matthew chapter 6, verses 19 and 20. Do not lay up for yourselves treasures upon the earth where moth and rust corrupt and where thieves break in and steal, but lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven where neither moth nor rust does corrupt and where thieves do not break in and steal. Pretty good principle. Remember, in Matthew 6, they didn't have the Bank of Jerusalem. So what they had were clothes and money. They hid their money oftentimes. Remember the parable? Dig a hole, it's in the ground. They put their money in the ground. They wore their clothes. They wore what they had financially. And so, like I say, they didn't have the Bank of Jerusalem to put their money in. They had things. And when Jesus says, don't lay up for yourselves treasures on earth, and he talks about moth and rust, that's what happens to those things. It says you need to be rich towards God. And you need to lay up your treasures in heaven. This man, seemingly, in the story as Jesus tells it, forgot all about that. Preacher, I'm sorry, but I don't know that those are the reasons Jesus called him a fool. Well, fine. We'll let you preach next Sunday night. No. The reality of it is that these are thoughts that I had and have had through the years with regards to this man and why Jesus called him a fool. Is it, as we said, is it wrong to have money? Absolutely not. Is it wrong to plan? To plan for retirement, to plan for some big financial windfall that you're going to have, to plan for future days, like having to replace the roof on your house or the air conditioner in your house. No, no, no. Is it wrong to have a savings account? No, I hope not. Got one. Don't have a lot in it, but I got one. But it is wrong to hold on to money and not be rich towards God, towards your fellow man. So get back to the very principle that Jesus was teaching. Beware of covetousness. Why? Because Jesus says, he says, one's life does not consist, one's life is not important in the things that he possesses. And so we're to be rich towards God. The spiritual is more important than the physical. Spiritual is more important than the physical. On the day of judgment, the Lord's not going to ask you about your bank account. But the Lord is going to ask you, did you prepare to meet me this evening? As you look at your life and you remember the teachings of Jesus, you're asked that very question. Where are you prepared, and are you prepared? And if not, you can be. All together we stand and sing.